Okay, so here's the last sheet in our framing discussion, and we call it era analysis. As I said, rather than look at the disruptions of the future, we all first want to take a look at one or maybe two disruptions of the past. So in your domain, when was the last time something really significant changed? And usually, as we say, it's an event. And events always appear in the newspaper or on the cable, on the news channels. These are not long-term things. There's something that happened on a particular day and it made headlines. It made news. And in that sense, it's a past event. The previous era was before the event, and the current era now is after the event. So it's a good idea to look back in history just a little bit, not all the way back, but when's the last time a significant event changed that domain, your domain, and what was it like before, and what was it like again? And I'll give you the purpose of doing this, but also for some other reason. Excuse me. Okay, so we're back to our chart. We skipped the second step there, scanning for now. Wendy's going to come back and do that this afternoon. So we're now going to do the forecasting step, which is the third of the 6 steps. And our product here is different kinds of futures. The first one is the baseline or the expected future. We're going to talk about that right away. And then we're going to do also alternative futures. Before we get to that, though, I think it's important to understand why we do forecasting. Well, it's obvious, you know. The first one, we know what's going to happen. Our client wants to know what's going to happen. So that's the obvious one. One is to understand the flow of events and the flow of change, kind of get into how it's going. It's not a prediction. It's not saying, oh, this is where we will be in 2030, but these are kind of how things are changing. Very similar, I would say, to what a professional team, a football team would do. Now the women are playing in the World Cup, what they do practicing for the next team. So they play against their own team for a while, who is instructed to play like the other team. So they get used to how it is. They're not saying, oh, this is exactly how the game is going to go, but we're going to get some good ideas about how things change in this particular domain. Scenarios in the United States began with Herman Kahn, who was working at the Rand Corporation for the Department of Defense in the 1950s. And they were doing scenarios of nuclear war. Well, what if the Russians do, and what if we do, and then they do, and we do, and then they would start over. Well, what if they did something else, and we did, and they did? They weren't saying this is what's going to happen. They were saying, let's practice. Let's play like we're in the future, and we get the understanding of the dynamics of change. And the third purpose is perhaps the most important, and that is every time we talk about the future, we are not only using the information that we've gathered in the scanning step, all the research we've done, but we're also bringing assumptions together. One icebreaker exercise that I like to do in a class like yours is to ask people to guess or to estimate their rank on various variables. So if everybody in the class lined up from the smallest person to the tallest person, you would have a rank. You could count off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they have to kind of think about, you can look around and see that. But I ask them things like how far they came, when the last time they changed jobs and things like that. Well, they know the data, they know their job, they know the last time they changed jobs, but they make an assumption about everybody else. And they get pretty close, though not exact. Every time we talk about, well, we believe the future could be this, we're also implying or even stating our assumptions. If the assumption is change is driven by the economy, then we will probably get to this level down the line. And that's so that's the purposes of forecasting. The future itself has 3 different kinds of, we talked about how we learn about the future in the fundamentals class. We learned about it in science class, in history class, in social sciences. and we came up with 3 different kinds of futures. The first of that is, as I mentioned, the expected future. Just like in physics, where bodies tend to keep moving in the direction unless they're acted upon by a force. That's what we learned from Isaac Newton. So the same thing is true in social change. There's momentum. We're heading somewhere. And this is the future where we're heading. We're not saying that we will arrive there, but we say if nothing surprising happens, this is where we will end up. And that will be our first exercise, is to come up with the expected future. But we know that other things could happen, largely events. We may have assumptions that are incorrect, and therefore we can't say anything about it. So we come up with then alternative futures, and that's the second half of this section. And then finally, we are allowed to say, yes, but this is what we want to see happen, not what the world will give us, but this is something that we would like to help create ourselves. So given the expected and the alternative futures that are going on in the world, we say, we want to head more in this direction, and therefore use planning and action to try and head in that direction. We're not going to do the preferred future here today. We are, however, going to do the expected and the alternative futures. So as I said, 3 different mechanisms of change. Momentum, we're headed a particular way. This is where we will end up. Disruption, that's the punctuated equilibrium. We will go along for a while until we have a disruption, and then we'll be in a transition period for a little while, and then start a new era. And then finally, the choices that we make. Choices of choosing our preferred future, choices of time, how we're going to spend our time, our resources to try and influence that future. All of these 3 things are operating simultaneously, so we can't forget and leave any one of them out. And do that. These 3 futures each have a different foundation, a different way of saying this is the expected future. The expected future, or the baseline future, is pretty much the social science techniques. If you were given a paper in college to say, well, give me the future of the automobile, the expected future is pretty much what you would do. There's no specific futuristics involved. It's just basically saying, here's where we're headed, and this is probably where we will end up. The plausible future, though, the alternative futures, have a much different source. They're our imagination. What might happen instead? We don't have so much data on them as we have ideas about what could happen. What could be the surprise? What is the scenario, and how does it come about? Wendy will talk to you about a concept called weak signals. There are signals of change. Signals is like, when you come up to a traffic stop, there's a signal. It's red or green, and that tells you what to do. These are signals pointing in various directions. Strong signals, like trends and plans that others will make, stakeholders will make, those are strong signals. We have data on them. They're probably going to affect the future, and we do the research on that. The weak signals are other things out there that could grow up to be strong signals, but they're not strong signals yet. And Wendy will have, and they're the basis of the alternative. What if this weak signal, this little bit of information, grows up to be really important, and then we have much different future. And I'll use choices and images of a better future. So the cone is also, we're doing, the first thing we're going to do is the baseline, and that has implications. We may have the opportunity to do those implications now. But it's not just the baseline, it's all of the futures, the cone again, which also have implications. And then finally, one piece of that is the visionary future or the preferred future as that goes forward. So here is the most complicated chart of the whole thing. And then we can go on. We've talked a little bit about it already. The yellow here is your domain definition. You've noticed that. We've done current conditions, we've noticed that, and we've done the era analysis, a little bit of history. So that's our framing step. We've been through all of that. Remember, the current conditions is like a photograph. It's not a movie, it's a photograph, it's static. So we take that forces of change and we move that into the future. There are 2 kinds of forces of change. Those that lead to the baseline future, which is, as you'll see in a second, trends and plans. and then those have assumptions associated with them. But then the potential events, emerging issues, and new ideas all create uncertainty. We don't know that an event will occur or not. We don't know whether an issue will develop or not. And so those are the uncertainties. Uncertainties then lead to alternative futures. So we've got a few strong signals going to the baseline. We have weak signals going into uncertainties. One thing we do is to identify what are called leading indicators. These are things that happen before the scenario becomes true. They're the early signs. We identify those. And then from these futures, we identify implications. What might happen and what's the impact? What's the impact on the client there? And then you get into the plans. What's our response? What's our policy? What's our plans of action? So that's kind of an introduction to forecasting and how the whole process works from beginning to end. All right, so let's talk about the very first of these, which is the expected future, and what we use to try and understand what the expected future may be. Remember, this is just purely social science. There's no tricks, no surprising things. This is where the future is headed, and we want to describe it that way. Here's an example of an expected future. A very famous futurist, Peter Schwartz. He was a director of strategic planning for Shell in the 1980s, and he came back to the United States and wrote a very famous book called The Art of the Long View, and that one is an excellent introduction to scenario work and foresight in general. He also wrote this book called The Long View. No, it's a great book. It's very, very good. Yeah, it's a great introduction to foresight. So he came up with this scenario called the long boom, which basically is that although we've had recessions and had some changes, that for the most part, the world economy is still moving towards growth, globalization, more technology, and some degree of sustainability, but it's not as important as that. So that's an example of an expected future. All right, so we believe the baseline future is more probable than any of the other futures, but is bound to happen to some extent. Some parts of the baseline will happen and other parts will not. We don't know which is which, but we do need to explore what some of those alternative futures are. And those, of course, are what we call the scenarios. As I said, the expected future is pure social science. It's linear thinking, the end of trend extrapolation. Now we get into a completely different mindset, a completely different way of thinking, because we're not using data as much as we were before, and we're bringing in more of our imagination. We are allowed to speculate. We're allowed to answer the question, what if this or what if that, which may happen or may not happen. So it's a completely different way of thinking. Both of these are important. Neither one is right. Neither one is better than the others, but it's a different kind of a way of thinking. A scenario is a product that describes some possible future state, or that tells the story about such a state, how such a state might come about. Those two forms of the scenario, the first is called a day in the life. So you've heard scenarios where people say, well, I woke up in the morning, my virtual assistant said, this is what the temperature and this is what you're going to do today, and those kind of things. That's a day in the life type scenario. It's a slice of life. The other is what's called a future history, which is from today, here's what happens and how this future comes about. They're both fine. Either one of those is a fine way of saying it. The scenarios themselves were developed a long time ago, as I say, in the 1950s and 60s in the US, to some extent in Europe. And the Royal Dutch Shell Company in the 1970s adopted scenarios as their preferred way of doing The Art of the Long View, which Rosa mentioned has been translated into Portuguese, is an excellent story. I like to think that every story, and particularly in this, its most important characteristic is that it's interesting. Oh, I never thought about it. Oh, yes, you're right. That could, so it has to be some interest. A lot of scenarios are not interesting. They're just boring. So we want to make it interesting. At the same time, the second one of these, we want to make it plausible. We want to say, yeah, I think that could, I don't think it's going to happen, but it could. And in that sense, it's both interesting and plausible. Some of the most interesting things, like science fiction, are not plausible. And the most plausible things, like the baseline, is sometimes not interesting. So, and it has to be relevant for our purpose. Pierre Bach was the inventor of the scenario process at Shell in the 1970s. And Peter Schwartz quotes him as the purpose of scenarios is not to predict the future. It's to gather and transform intelligence with fresh perceptions. So we want to see the future differently. We want to see a future that we had not thought of before. We want to be ready for unexpected change. If I were to add to that quote, I call it conditioning. Conditioning like physical conditioning. Why do we exercise? Well, because our muscles get stronger, our heart rate goes up, we're in better shape after we exercise. And the same is true of scenarios. We are exercising our ability to imagine being in a different future. So why do we put these in the form of stories? Because we're not interested in the details. We're interested in the feel. We're interested in what it's going to be like, and in a very general sense. So we want the essence of this future, not the details. But an interesting outcome is even if none of the futures comes true, it is still worth doing. I like to point out to people that jogging, which is a form of exercise that people like to do, jogging is not transportation. You don't get anywhere. You end up right where you started, but you are more fit. You are in better shape. So this is the same thing for expecting the future. We are more fit to handle change. If one of these scenarios does occur, well, good, we've thought about it. Even if none of them occurs, we're in better shape to handle change after we've done this kind of exercise. So we saw the long boom as the baseline scenario from Peter Schwartz. An alternative scenario is called the soft path. This gentleman, his name is Amory Lovins. He runs an institute in Colorado, which does a lot with sustainability, technology, and measurement. And these would be a world of what Andy describes as enoughness. We have enough. We have enough cars. We have enough food. We have enough. We have to stop acquiring and stop growing and just get enough of our lives. There are limits, sustainability, and grassroots-driven change. So this is an alternative scenario called the soft path. And it's a scenario that Amory Lovins would put out. Now, it's not his scenario versus Schwartz's scenario. It's not one is right and one is wrong. We're dealing with all of these now as a set, as different points of the cone when we finally get out to our time horizon. So the soft path has a lot of differences from today, and we can look through those. So how do we come up with alternative scenarios? The most famous way to do it is this process that Peter Schwartz and Pierre Bach at Shell created, and then Schwartz brought it back to the US. GBN was the name of their company, the Global Business Network. And you see that there are basically 5 major steps in their process. First, it's to do focus, orient. That's our framing step. We want to get right with the client. We want to understand the domain. Not doing any futures yet, all of that. Then we explore. Schwartz calls them certainties and uncertainties. I wouldn't use those terms. I don't think anything is certain, but there are things that are more certain and things that are less certain. I've already talked about the strong signals are fairly certain to continue. The events and the emerging issues are uncertain. So we do all that. We synthesize those. We take all that information, just like you did. You took all those trends and put them into a description of a future. We take now all the uncertainties and put them into, synthesizes the third step, and we create a framework. Sometimes we call it a kernel or a logic. It's just a very short description. This is a future in which, short paragraph. And then we elaborate it in terms of stories and other forms of presentation that I'll point out. Get insights in terms of the implications of those scenarios. What difference does it make us? What options do we have? What does the world presenting to us? And then finally, we set up a monitoring system with the indicators and the early warnings about how those scenarios would come about. That's basically the GBN process. It's very similar to the Houston process that you're talking about. So we first orient, frame, we then explore, study, we then create scenarios, and we do implications and monitor. This is the famous 2x2 scenario process technique, which they use at Shell and GBN and others. For a while, it was the only technique. Almost everybody did it. We now have other techniques, and I'll point out one other one. But this is the one where you take two uncertainties, and this is one that Andy did for a client many years ago. In the vertical axis, it's who is in charge of the world. W1 are the currently developed countries, and W2 are the rising countries like China and Brazil, and countries like that. Who is the dominant power? That's the vertical. On the horizontal, it's do we use the traditional modern values, or do we have kind of postmodern values of wellness and enoughness and things like that? Each of these then creates four scenarios, and it's a very common technique for people to do when they're doing scenarios. Any questions? Let me do a couple of other things first. Here's another technique, which are called scenario archetypes. This was first shared by Jim Dater, who ran the program at the University of Hawaii, very famous and well-known futurist, one of the founders of the field. Discovered in looking over many, many scenarios is that most scenarios fit into one of four types of scenarios, or archetypes. Continuation is basically the baseline scenario. Things continue as they have been, and the future is different, but there are no disruptions, there are no surprises. It's pretty much what we expect. Collapse obviously has very dramatic, I mean, the system just basically goes away. Dater had a third category, which he called discipline, in which the world really got very tight with lots of rules to try and preserve itself. Andy has come up with this concept called new equilibrium. It's a new era, but the system is still pretty much in shape. There's the major change, but the system itself has not changed. And then finally, transformation, which is a completely different system. Examples of transformation would be from horse-drawn vehicles to automobiles, or sailing ships to jet airliners, or hand calculations with machines, with adding machines to spreadsheets. Those would be major transformations in a system. So those are the two, I would say today, probably most popular ways of doing scenarios. There are many, many others, all of which are in the literature, but I don't know that people use them all that much. So let me pause and see if anybody has any questions about scenarios in general or about these techniques for doing them. Okay, great. So we have these kind of techniques. In coming up with scenarios, it's also a good idea to have inputs. Again, this is where the things will come when you're doing your research, the scanning that Wendy is going to talk to you about this afternoon. So we have two categories at the top, which are the same as the categories in the baseline. You had trends and plans. So if the trend continues, you get one kind of future, but we know that oftentimes trends do not continue. So we call that a trend break. It twists, it turns, it stops altogether, and therefore we get a different future. Plans that stakeholders have, they're good intentions, but oftentimes they don't turn out to be true. And so that would be unfulfilled plans that do not come to accomplishment. They don't achieve their goals. What happens instead? What does the company do or the stakeholder do? 3 new categories are something we've talked about already, potential events. Remember, we did events when we looked at the difference between the previous era and the current era. Well, now we're going to think about a significant event that will create a new era in the future. We can't know what it is, we can't predict it, but we can ask the question, what if? What if this event were to happen? What if that event were to happen? And what would that new era look like? The 4th category are issues. They're basically decisions that people are arguing about. In the United States, we have issues of migration, we have issues of climate change, we have issues of governance and those kinds of things. If there is a decision to be made, are we going to, should we, should they, those kinds of things. And then kind of a last category of all kinds of other things, just a basically residual category. We're also interested, though, sometimes in actually elaborating that short description into something more imaginative. We've talked about stories. You can write a story. You can have characters and things like that. And we'll talk about that in a moment. You could create the front page of a newspaper or create a cable news broadcast of a day in the life of this particular scenario. I've gotten songs and poems and graphics that describe the scenario on and on. Almost anything that could exist in the future that you can think of and create as a way of carrying the message, carrying the essence of what it would be like living in this scenario. So that's the presentation. Remember, we talked about the kernel, which is this one here. Oops, this one. And then the elaboration into some more imaginative presentation. This is optional. You don't have to do this, but if you want to talk to the public, it's a good idea to put things into this type of a form. So if you have a story or any kind of a representation, you should always remember interesting characters and events. It's like you're writing a movie script or a TV script. There should be some conflict and drama. It's not just, oh, then all this happened and we're all happy or we're sad or whatever. No, there should be some, what's going to turn out? How's this going to turn out? Who's going to win this? And I always like to ask people to have a balance of what's good and not so good about that scenario. It's easy to write utopias, which are glorious, and dystopias, which are terrible. But trying to find something where there's, we've solved some problems, good things happen, but now we have these other problems. So the people of the future will be a lot like we are. We're grateful for the things that we are able to do, and we're concerned about the problems and the challenges that we have today. So keeping those 3 things in mind as you do a scenario presentation, some kind of a presentation. Any questions, comments about that?
So no exercise for this? Just have the...
No, we don't have time. No, we don't have time. Yeah. So the last piece then is, so what? So you have these scenarios for the client, and they want to know, what difference does that make to us? And this is what we do, is called implications analysis. An implication or a consequence is something that occurs because the scenario comes about or after the scenario comes about. And we use a device called a futures wheel. Rosa has done futures wheels. She can, well, in this example, let's imagine that we came up with a pill that slows down our aging process. Well, that means we have a longer life, companies make money, longer life means we have more workers, all of those kinds of things. If this happens, then this happens. If that happens, then this happens. If that happens, then this happens. And you kind of, it kind of expands. You usually do this on a whiteboard or flip chart so that everybody sees. It's brainstorming. It's doing the brainstorming there. And you can do that. When you're done brainstorming, you should then, you have your baseline scenario and the alternative scenario. You figure out 2 or 3 things that are most important, those things that you should really know about that future, and 2 or 3 things that may not happen, but boy, they sure are interesting. I never thought of that, how that should come about. And that will come right off. You just pick bubbles on your futures wheel to put in these categories. And once those categories, you have those categories, then you can come up with something called a strategic issue, which is something clients should pay attention to. Oh, you mean we don't know how to do this? or this is going to threaten us, or here's an opportunity that we should, in another country or another line of business, that we should take into account. And you can read all through this. You'll have these charts, and you can see how those come. Once you have a strategic issue, you can then do, and this is the last thing, an elevator speech. Imagine you're in an elevator with us, and he says, so what's up with the project you're working on, the issue you're working on? And you've done this ahead of time, so you know why this issue is important, the why, what we should do about it, the what, and two hows. How do we make it happen, and who owns it as a responsible? So this is not a plan. It's just basically a talking points. Oh, when somebody asks, this is our elevator speech. So let me briefly run through all this one more time. So you've done the scenarios. You do a futures wheel. Rosa can show how you do that. You put the baseline scenario in the center and all of its implications. Then you do another one, put your alternative scenario in the center and do another one. And as many scenarios as you have, or as many futures wheels as you want, you do as many of those. What are the most important and provocative implications that come off the wheel? What are the strategic issues? And what's your elevator speech for those?